I'm delighted to welcome everyone who's arrived and also all the people who haven't. I'm Abby Stewart, and it is really my great pleasure as current president of the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, which is also Division 9 of APA, to welcome you to this first of 5 webinars on the subject of fostering policy-relevant psychological research. Of course, you know that this is a subject at the center of SPICY's core mission, but we were delighted to be enthusiastically joined by representatives of 5 other divisions of the American Psychological Association, Divisions 8, which is Personality and Social Psychology, 27, which is Community Psychology, 35, Psychology of Women, 44, Psychology of Sexual Orientation and Gender Diversity, and 45, Psychological Study of Culture, Ethnicity, and Race, to plan the grant proposal to APA's Committee on Divisions/APA Relations, or CODAPAR, that is funding this series. We're grateful to all of those divisions and to CODAPAR for the support. And Sara, Policy Director of SPICY, provided us with expert advice and support throughout the process. The committee worked together to plan the topics for the overall series of 5 webinars, which will take place across calendar year 2023, 2 this spring and 3 in the fall. Each webinar was planned by representatives of at least 2 of the divisions, though many members of the committee are members of more than one of the participating and perhaps also other divisions. It's been a great pleasure to work collaboratively with this outstanding group of colleagues from across the field and the country. We decided as a whole group that we would also create toolkits for individuals who want to read or listen to more about the topic and to assist instructors in covering these issues, particularly in the graduate classroom. You'll hear more about the initial toolkit soon. In addition, we agreed that all 6 divisions would post material from the webinars and the toolkits on our websites and would be free to draw on them as we host further activities at our meetings and conferences or just on our websites. So please look for these materials and pass on this information to others you think would be interested. The detailed invitations to speakers and planning of particular webinars was turned over to 2 or 3 individuals within the committee representing at least 2 different divisions. For today's webinar, Sara Buckingham, Nate Deichert, and Raquel Rose planned and organized everything. I'll now turn things over to them, starting with Nate from Black Hills State University. Thanks, Nate.
Thank you, Abby. Hello to everyone, and thank you all for joining us today for this webinar. It's my pleasure to introduce our panelists who will be speaking with us today. Our first panelist is the Regents Professor Emeritus of Psychology and Marketing at Arizona State University, Dr. Robert Cialdini. Dr. Cialdini is a world-renowned social psychologist and author who is best known for his groundbreaking research in the areas of influence and persuasion. Dr. Cialdini received his PhD from the University of North Carolina and completed his postdoctoral training at Columbia University. Over the course of his career, Dr. Cialdini has published over 200 articles and books, including Influence, the Psychology of Persuasion, and more recently, Persuasion, a Revolutionary Way to Influence and Persuade, both of which were New York Times bestsellers and have sold over 7 million copies in 44 different languages. Dr. Cialdini has received numerous awards for his work, including the Donald T. Campbell Award for Distinguished Scientific Contributions to Social Psychology, the Award for Distinguished Service to the Discipline of Personality and Social Psychology from SPSP, the Distinguished Scientist Award from the Society of Experimental Social Psychology, the Distinguished Scientific Achievement Award from the Society of Consumer Psychology, the Pytho Award for Distinguished Contributions to the Science of Social Influence, and the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Western Psychological Association. In 2018, Dr. Cialdini was elected as a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the following year was elected as a member of the National Academy of Sciences. Please welcome Dr. Robert Cialdini.
Hello.
Dr. Beth SHINN is the Cornelius Vanderbilt Endowed Chair and Professor of Human and Organizational Development at Vanderbilt University. Dr. SHINN, who earned her PhD from the University of Michigan, is a prominent scholar and researcher in the fields of homelessness and poverty, publishing more than 100 academic works, including her 2020 book with Jill Kaduri, In the Midst of Plenty, Homelessness and What to Do About It. In 2010, her book, Toward Positive Youth Development, Transforming Schools and Community Programs, received the Social Policy Edited Book Award from the Society for Research on Adolescence. Her research has been funded through the National Science Foundation, the National Institute of Mental Health, and the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, to name a few. In addition, work by Dr. SHINN and her students have led to policy changes increasing the efficiency of homelessness prevention services in New York City. In recognition of her contributions to the field, Dr. SHINN has been the recipient of numerous awards, including the Society for Community Research and Action Seymour B. Saracen Award for Community Research, as well as the Award for Distinguished Contributions to Theory and Research in Community Psychology, the Distinguished Service Award from the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, and the SWIN Ethnic Minority Achievement Award from APA for Excellence in Mentoring Ethnic Minority Students. Welcome, Dr. SHINN. Our third panelist is Dr. Rush Holt. Dr. Holt earned his PhD in physics from New York University and served on the faculty of Swarthmore College, teaching courses in both physics and public policy, before becoming the assistant director of the Princeton Plasma Physics Laboratory, one of the largest alternative energy research facilities in the country. Prior to being elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1999 to represent New Jersey's 12th Congressional District, Dr. Holt worked on Capitol Hill as an American Association for the Advancement of Science Congressional Science Fellow in 1982 and 1983, and at the United States State Department as a nuclear armed control expert. While serving as only one of 3 research physicists in Congress, Dr. Holt served on the Committee on Natural Resources, the Committee on Education and Labor, the Committee on the Budget, and the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, and he chaired the Select Intelligence Oversight Panel. His advocacy for federal funding of scientific research helped secure over $22 billion in new funding. Following his time in Congress, Dr. Holt was CEO of the American Association for the Advancement of Science until his retirement in 2019, and is a recipient of the association's William D. Carey Lectureship Award in 2005 and the Philip Haig Abelson Award in 2010, as well as various other awards and honorary degrees. He is a 5-time winner on Jeopardy and also defeated IBM's Watson in the game. Please welcome Dr. Rush Holt. I will now turn things over to the moderator for today's webinar, Dr. Sara Buckingham, Associate Professor of Clinical Community Psychology from the University of Alaska, Anchorage, and member of APA Division 27, Society for Community Research and Action.
Thank you so much, Nate, and thank you so much to our panelists for being here today. As you have heard, as you registered for this webinar, this is a kickoff to a broader series. And so our purpose today is broad, simply to begin considering the critical link between research and policy and how we can get started. So we have a few questions to get our conversation started with our panelists today, and then we'll move to questions submitted by you when you registered, as well as any questions that you might have that come up for you during the panel today. As Sara Mancall put in the chat, please feel free to add any questions that you have for our panelists into the Q&A box, and as time allows, we will certainly try our best to get to them. So our first question for our panelists today is, what prompted you as a scientist, as a researcher, to think about policy? And let's turn to you, Dr. Cialdini, first.
Well, as Nate indicated in that introduction, all my life I've been a persuasion and social influence researcher. And about midway through my career, I asked myself, well, what's the one issue that I could make a contribution to, given my understanding of that research tradition, that would make the most difference, that I think is most important to impact. And it was the environment. How could I arrange for communicators to know how to message the individual citizenry, as well as their elected representatives, to take steps that would result in more pro-environmental outcomes? Right? So it was starting with the recognition of what I was steeped in and what I had expertise in, and what I could then contribute to the most pressing problem that I saw. Notice it wasn't, what's the most pressing problem that I saw? Let's say it could be homelessness, or it could be child welfare. And then I had to start doing research in those areas. I started with the place I was already knowledgeable about, which made it a much easier lift to get into the study of pro-environmental behavior.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Cialdini. Let's go to you, Dr. Shinn. And what prompted you as a scientist to think about policy?
Yeah, well, thanks for having us. I guess I got started in two steps. One was back when I did my undergraduate thesis when I was in college, and I looked at the merger of a girls' school and a boys' school to become a coeducational institution, high schools. And this is 50 years ago. It might not look at all this way today. But I was using the theoretical approach of fear of success, and I saw girls' fear of success go up and their performance go down. And those girls whose fear of success went up the most had the biggest decrements in performance, and the boys were completely unaffected. And I gave these results to the school, and they said, "What do we do?" And I went back to my august professors at Harvard, and I said, "What do we do? The school wants to know, what to do." And they said, "This is a really interesting study. Maybe you should publish it." So I never did publish it, but I did decide that I wanted to do research that would make people's circumstances and lives better. And I totally support basic research, but what I wanted to do was to try to make a difference. And then when I got involved in homelessness, it became increasingly clear from the results of the research that the kinds of solutions that would make a difference in people's lives involved social policy. They involved housing, they involved income, they didn't involve, psychotherapy or individual level interventions.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Shinn. Turn it to you then, Dr. Holt.
From my earliest memories, I've been interested in how the world, the universe works, and how people get along. I mean, that's science and politics. I never saw any incompatibility there. All of my colleagues in either of those worlds thought that they couldn't possibly work in the other world. I've, over my career, run into many, many people who have learned it is not only possible, but it's very satisfying to straddle those two worlds. And science has a lot to bring to policy, and an understanding of policy actually has a lot to bring to science. So if the ultimate goal is improved human welfare, there's certainly all sorts of problems to be addressed and all sorts of opportunities to be seized. So on the negative side, on problems, I mean, you've got everything from nuclear warfare and increased violence in a technological age, and climate change, and feeding and housing 10 billion people. On the positive side, you have policies about, the advantages of a distributed workforce, or the advantages of a diverse workforce. And something that is actually both positive and negative would be increased interaction among previously separated regions and tribes. So that leads to pandemics and conspiracy theories that take flight, or economic instabilities and so forth. Social sciences, including psychological sciences, have something to bring to all of those. And it just, I don't know, it was self-evident that this is important and must be done.
Excellent. You're all making the case for the next question that I really have for you, which is that both research and policy are situated at promoting human welfare, and therefore scientists should certainly care about policy. And we have people on this webinar who maybe have never thought about the policy implications of their work, or are just starting to get started in this space and thinking about policy. So I'd love to hear from you your best pitch for why scientists should care about policy. And Dr. Shinn, I'll start with you.
Mhm. Well, I think citizens should care about policy. To be part of the citizenry. If we're concerned about a livable world for ourselves and for our children and grandchildren, we need to think about climate policy. If we want to think about poverty and income inequality and racism and other forms of social exclusion, we need to think about policy solutions to those. And so I think everybody should care about policy. What scientists have is an additional set of tools to bring to bear to try to understand how problems come about, what solutions seem to be most viable. And so we can bring the tools that we have, just as Dr. Cialdini said at the beginning. He started with what the tools that he had were to bring to bear on important problems. And so scientists, like other citizens, should care about policy, but we have some special ways of approaching it.
Is there anything you might like to add to that, Dr. Holt?
Well, first of all, I should say, I rudely jumped into answering the question last time before thanking you for including me here and telling you how honored I am to be invited and to be with the other panelists. I might seem like an interloper. In the introduction, Nate said I'm a physicist and all that. But in defense, I guess I'll say, when I was on the faculty at Swarthmore, I taught on not only the wide array of physics courses, but I also taught a couple of times a course that was co-listed in psychology, mathematics, and physics on decision making. It was really a public policy course. Recently, a year or two ago, I wrote a book. Actually, what it was a reissue of the book by Vannevar Bush, Science, the Endless Frontier, with a companion essay by me about what should be policy today, and trying to make a distinction between policy for science. In other words, what's the funding going to be, or open sources or whatever, and policy and science for policy. How are we going to solve these international problems, and how are we going to seize these important opportunities?
Wonderful. I'm going to turn it to you, Dr. Cialdini, but before I do, I just want to mention that an audience member simply said that they concur wholeheartedly with your statement that citizens should care about policy, and that's where we come from as psychologists, scientists in this space. Thank you, Dr. Holt. Dr. Cialdini, what is your pitch for why scientists should care about policy?
Two reasons. One has to do with the ability to scale up the outcomes and insights from our work to a much larger audience, a much larger group of individuals who can participate in and benefit from those outcomes and those insights. I mean, doing it in the laboratory or with our subject population and then just publishing it to a group of colleagues is a very constrained population for making a difference or informing people properly about some dynamic that they hadn't recognized before. If we build it into policy, now we increase the reach of our work in ways that have an impact on the larger community, the non-academic community, to a much greater extent than if we stay constrained to our particular domains. The other really has to do with something that's a little more self-oriented, and that is, for a long time now, observers of national behavioral and social science scene, the scene, as well as sympathetic elected officials, I'm going to include Dr. HOLT in that, have been warning us for a long time that unless we as researchers clearly demonstrate the value of their explorations to the wider society, right? Support by the politicians who represent those non-academic individuals, right, will be less likely to fund our research into the future because they will be listening to what their constituents say about what they think is important. And if we don't make the case that what we do impacts their lives and can impact public policy that does increase their outcomes, right, we will be increasingly titrated out of the funding streams. So for those two reasons, impact and then support for what we do, that's my rationale for why we ought to get involved in public policy research.
Thank you, Dr. Cialdini. In that, you're going back to, in some ways, Dr. Holt's comments about, that distinction we have of policy for science and science for policy, and how the two of them are intertwined, that by utilizing our science for policy, we are also creating policy for science and creating support for the work that we're doing. I would love to get your advice on what you think scientists should be doing in order to have their research inform policy. What are first steps that folks should be taking? Maybe I'll start with you, Dr. Holt, from a policy insider perspective.
Sure. Let me begin first by talking about the environment in which the policy is being made, and as it applies to scientists. The American public is less supportive right now of scientists being involved in policymaking. It's interesting, this recent survey information, looking at the past 3 years, so before COVID and post-COVID, or well, maybe we're not post yet, but those who were not supportive of scientists being actively involved in policymaking have grown from 39% to 51%. So it's not always comfortable for scientists to be involved in policy, even though I think it is urgent. I would also say support for decisions delivered by experts. In other words, tech has waxed and waned over the decades, over the life of this country. And so it's a difficult dance to provide scientific findings to the policy process in a way that is consistent with democratic governance. And the confidence and the willingness of the public and their representatives. And remember, I served in the House of Representatives, and remember that word. Everybody thinks that there are 435 really smart people. Most of them are really smart. Engaged people, most of them are engaged, most of them are altruistic, but they are representative of the population at large. And they have the same hopes and fears and misapprehensions that the general public has. And so the public and their representatives are reticent to make technical and scientific decisions. They just don't feel they know enough to do it. A common phrase, I'd be introduced by one of my colleagues to a friend of theirs. Here's Rush Holt. He's a scientist. When I was in school, I did terrible in science. That's what the legislators say. And so there is a response, there's a burden, really, or an opportunity on the scientists to make this science not just intelligible for the policymakers, but inviting to the policymakers. So I'll say a little bit more about the environment in which we find ourselves. And then, well, I don't want to go on too long, but right now we are awash in misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theories, or to put it maybe less malignantly, or I mean, just as malignantly, but less obvious, we're awash in raw and unmoored opinions. So policy debates are, it's warfare of opinions, not evidence-based findings. And so with all of these problems that we face, I think the biggest problem we face and the biggest opportunity for science to bring something that will make a difference is the environment in which policy is being made, the very idea of decision-making, the very value of science. What does science bring here that will get us away from this war of unmoored opinions and misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theory, and so forth? And if you need any evidence that this is important, look at the 200,000 needless deaths in the last 2 years from COVID, because people did not understand or accept the scientific findings that were presented to them. They didn't feel that they had any part in those findings or any identification with those findings. They weren't for them, and it was deadly. But you can say the same thing about climate change. You can say the same thing about crushing economic inequalities, about gun violence, opiate misuse, and so forth. The scientists have to show that there is a democratic way of involving expert opinion in facing these issues.
Could you follow up on that a little bit, Dr. Holt? Because what you're saying is so important. How do scientists make their pitches, their information more intelligible and inviting to policymakers?
I mean, you're doing three different things. I mean, not necessarily all at once, but social science brings three things to the policymaking process. One is a description of how things are. You know, that's what science is. It's this, you know, it's a way of asking questions so they can be answered empirically and verifiably. It's that simple. A third grader can understand it. But most scientists don't present science that way, and therefore policymakers don't understand that what they're bringing is knowledge about how things are that is as reliable as we can achieve now. You know, their provision, it's provision knowledge and so forth. But that's one thing. The second thing scientists, and I mean social scientists just as much here as physical or earth scientists or whatever, they can make policies work. And in fact, social scientists have an advantage by implementing nudges, things that are learned, you know, in behavioral psychology that get people to do the right things that the policy is trying to accomplish. Removing heuristic biases, describing the psychology of decision-making, and so forth. That is something that scientists bring to the decision-making process to make policies work better. And the third thing, and this is what I'm harping on because no one else is, or not enough people are, I think, you have to improve the environment for decision-making. You have to empower the public to guide and oversee the policymakers, not let the public relegate these decisions to the experts. Because if they do that, the experts will give them vaccines that they won't take. So the policy just won't work. And so that's a third and different thing. It is address, and it's based on what science is. And so among the things that scientists can do is show the general public and their representatives that science works, that the way it works is available to them too, not just to the experts. They can have better decision-making if they learn the lessons of science, not the terminology of science, not the historical key experiments, but rather the lessons of science.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Holt. I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Cialdini, for your thoughts on how scientists can make their research inform policy.
I would say whenever possible, do that work in the field. As I said earlier, there's a tendency for the larger non-academic community to be doubting the relevance of our work to their lives, right? Because very often in laboratory situations of various kinds with constrained populations and essentially hothouse-like arrangements, they don't easily translate our results to their situations and settings and circumstances. But if you do your work in the field, the relevance is manifest. So for example, when we've done research on how to communicate with homeowners about conserving energy in their home compared to what their neighbors, their comparable neighbors are doing, right? The relevance is right. They've been in their homes, they know their neighbors, they recognize that those are comparable situations, and they see the results of those studies that we do in communicating that message as relevant to their lives. And so that's one thing that field research does. It makes relevance prominent and transparent. All right. The other thing that it does is it reduces the likelihood that your work will not be replicated. We're in a replication crisis right now, right? People are always publishing failures to replicate, and we're involved in this back and forth about it. And one thing that field research does, if you do research in naturally occurring settings with all kinds of other factors that are allowed to vary in those settings, not the kind that you block out or eliminate in your laboratory, right? And you show effects, those are likely to be enduring and powerful effects that have stood the test of all those buffeting external phenomena that you have to persevere through in order to get your effects. So you will have a better, I think, product to present to people about this. And here's another reason to do it if you're concerned about replication that might not support your findings. If you do field research, people will be less likely to undertake to replicate your research because it takes too much. They can do a laboratory study just like you did, but go into the field and really study how people react in various kinds of, that's a big undertaking. And so they'll pass. They'll go try to fail to replicate somebody else's research.
Thank you, Dr. Cialdini, for that plug for field research. Dr. Shinn, I'll turn it to you. What advice do you have for folks?
Boy, well, hard act to follow here. For one, I'd say scientists need a little bit of humility. I mean, we're an important voice, but we're not the only voice. And in the political process, we have some information to offer, but we shouldn't assume that we're going to be the philosopher kings of the world. In this time of polarization and the kinds of pressures that Dr. Holt was describing, I think it's often easier to work with administrative executive branch agencies than it is with legislative groups. And legislative groups are in their tribes, and they're trying to score points with their constituents, and they're thinking about the primary fights. And executive branch agencies have problems that they need to solve. And the solution to that problem is not necessarily a Democratic solution or a Republican solution. If you can help people solve problems, they're often more interested in listening to you. But you do have to get out of your office, not just to field research, which I totally support, but to interact with the policymakers. I mean, publishing it in an academic journal and saying, oh, I just did policy relevant research, come policymakers, read it, is never going to work, right? As one health department director said, academic research is hard to get. It's often behind paywalls, and it's hard to read. And so if you want your research to make a difference in a policy world, you need to be willing to take it to the policymakers. You need to often answer the questions that they want answered, as opposed to the next question that might come out of your research program. And to make this an ongoing interaction where you're trying to be helpful to them and also learning from them about the problems that they're facing and how you might be helpful. With respect to field research, which I do totally support, sometimes we need to prioritize external validity over internal validity. That is, we want to show that something will work somewhere, and then it's more likely to work somewhere else. So we don't want to, in the hothouse of our laboratories, devise these marvelous interventions and bestow them on the community. We can often prospect for what's working in the community, and then try to, or what's being done in the community, and to evaluate rigorously whether it works, so that we've already shown that it can be acceptable, at least in some places, and now perhaps we can help to spread what's likely to work. But policymakers and academics aren't so very different. I mean, we may care about theory, they care about how and why things work. We may care about external validity. They want to know, is it going to work here? They care about people's motivations. And so there's really a lot that we have in common if we're willing to talk plain language, as opposed to the jargon that we all learn in graduate school.
I so appreciate you giving those parallels in vocabulary across and synonyms we might hear in these different spaces. All of you have spent a good amount of time talking about field research, external validity, like seeing what is happening in spaces. And we had a number of questions that came in around ensuring that any sort of policy relevant research is actually informed by communities that policies impact, about the role of community-based participatory research. And so I'd like to move into that space a little bit and thinking about what role community participatory research plays in gearing science towards policy moving forward. This is a question from one of our audience members today. Do you see the research as a whole shifting over time as more community advocates are learning research skills, putting together community review boards, and are being engaged in academic community research partnerships? And if so, what could we do to keep up that shift and make sure that those partnerships are successful and funded? So big sets of ideas, but wondering if one of you might want to take it.
Let me start. I think it's really salutary development to be thinking so much about community values and community input into the questions that we ask, the interventions that we try to design, and that's a tremendously useful development. Too often, community-based participatory research is kind of small bore. It too often just focuses on a very local problem in a very local community, but it doesn't have to be that way. And I think we can often be guided by just regular folks about what's going to be acceptable in communities, and what's likely to work here, how something is likely to be received. And so that's a very important step. How to get it funded is somebody else's problem. I don't know how to deal with that.
Thank you,
Maybe my
Dr.
colleagues
Shinn.
have some answers.
Well, I can also reinforce what MARYBETH said, and maybe extend it to the point of bringing community members or those individuals who are from the settings we are studying to become participants in the research design. It's not just that we should hear from them about what their concerns are. They should be complicit in the process of doing the work, doing the design of the studies at the formative level. Because we have experience, for example, that after we've shown certain effects and that the existing procedures weren't working in a particular arena, those in charge in those communities didn't implement those findings because they weren't part of it, right? If we had them helping us with the design and the methodology of the work from the outset, they were partners with us in it. And then they became very active in making sure that they communicated those results into their community because, as I say, they were complicit in those results. And as a researcher, a persuasion researcher, I've learned that if you want people to agree with and advocate for and further the results of your work, complicity is the king. Complicity is king. It's not a duke, it's not an earl, it's king, right? So bring them in, everybody wins, they inform the process, they inform the designs, and they carry forth the outcomes of those studies into the communities where they have an impact that we as scientists typically would not.
Thank you, Dr. Cialdini. If it's okay with you, Dr. Holt, I'm going to move to a new question just because we have so many. Because what you all are speaking to is so important, and yet we also recognize how time-consuming this is, right? Time-consuming to do this relationship building and being in this space and taking the extra step of translating and answering questions that policymakers have. And this is something I hear a lot from my students and from folks like me who are new and junior in our careers, saying that, it feels as though most academic researchers are only able to get involved in policy as an extracurricular, if you will, because they're not necessarily compensated for that time, feel pressured to publish, to get additional grants, to be in these other spaces that are not necessarily in the most policy relevant spaces. So how might you propose that we break this barrier? And it's open for anyone who might want to take it.
Well, I think universities need to change to value the kinds of work that people do with their communities and to value policy-related work. But we also, if we're academics, have enormous freedom to choose the problems that we're going to work on. And we can make those choices, and we should.
Yeah, I'm going to agree about that, and to say that the consequence, it doesn't have to require a lot of time and energy to build a connection, all right, to the individuals that we want to study. The research in persuasion science says there are two very small things you can do. Point out similarities that exist between you and the people that you are trying to influence or convince to move in your direction, help you with a project. And secondly, compliment them, give them honest praise. for those things that you see, and those immediately produce rapport as a platform, and you can begin the process without a whole lot of extra effort and time.
Let me actually, a lot of wisdom coming from Dr. Shinn and Cialdini here. Let me just add, it's to be involved in policy. And by the way, policy is not just government, just state government or federal government or regulatory agencies. It's also the educational establishment. It's also the philanthropy world. There is policy that comes out of that. And the researchers can be involved in developing that policy. They should be involved in developing that policy for all the reasons we gave. It can actually be very satisfying to be involved in that policy if you don't expect immediate results. Just because you have good results in research or good communication opportunity, and you think this will give better policy, it might. But what would I say? Restrain your expectations. Whether it's a regulatory agency or a legislative body, they move slowly, they move in fits and starts, and so forth. Skip used to be at NSF in social and behavioral sciences, did point out that social sciences have particular opportunity and a particular problem. And that is, yes, they are not soft sciences, they are hard sciences and very hard sciences. And in order to involve, as Dr. Cialdini says, the participating community, you got to do it. If your research is going to be received and accepted, and if it's going to be resilient, and in fact, even if it's going to be valid, if you don't involve a diverse input, you probably won't even have a valid result. But that's hard to do. And it's particularly hard when the people on the receiving end don't quite respect what you're doing. I mean, I've already told you that in the legislature, but also in these other areas, like most Americans, they don't feel real comfortable with science. They're not quite sure they should trust it. And when it comes to social sciences, they think it's self-evident. This isn't hard research like physics and chemistry. It's even softer than climate science. So you have to overcome that. And so be careful of this humility. Yes, there is a problem with arrogance and egotism in science. It's often talking down. It's often describing the problems here as in the deficit model, that if I only talk to you more persuasively, you'll believe me. And it is, so there is a call for some humility, but you also have to make it clear to any of these people that you're working with that this is real science achieved with the same empirical foundation and the same community validation that the other sciences have achieved. This is a long-standing problem. I mean, Vannevar Bush, wanted to set up a science agency in the 1940s that would fund all of science in America through defense science and except social sciences. He excluded social sciences from his overwhelming agency here. Now that overwhelming agency wasn't created, but the second class position of social sciences was baked in. And so you mustn't hide your light under a bushel here. when you come before Congress or the regulatory agencies, show that this is founded on evidence where the procedures to remove bias have been as demanding as those procedures in any other science. And so, be sure, and of course, this makes it that much harder. But it can be very satisfying to see that you are having some effect on the policy.
And I just tag on to what Russ just said, and that is that he was saying, don't think of policy just as governmental policy. There are policies that NGOs are responsible for, that philanthropists are responsible for. There's another sector that as social and behavioral scientists, we have ignored entirely, and in fact, have avoided, I think, deliberately, and that is the private sector. Organizational, that group of individuals and organizations that deal with workplace issues, deal with all kinds of diversity issues and so on, those policies inside those groups are very consequential. And if we can influence the private sector, right? I will just say that a number of years ago, people asked me, okay, so you're retiring, Cialdini, from your university positions. What, if you look back on it, what's the thing you're most proud of? It's something I never thought I would do. It was to partner with an organization, a startup company that was trying to communicate with homeowners about how to reduce their energy consumption in the home, right? So we developed a set of interventions that we would communicate with them every month about how they stood relative to their neighbors in energy conservation, right? And after 10 years, we have saved 36 billion pounds of carbon dioxide from entering our atmosphere by sending those messages now to 100 separate utilities around the United States, right? That's a policy. It's about environmental policy, but it's a policy within these organizations now. These utilities, right, do this. I thought I would never be related, partner with the private sector. That's for the biological scientists, that's for the physical scientists, they do those kinds of things. Believe me, I would never make that mistake again of underestimating the power of those organizations as a force for policy in our culture.
Yeah. Let me make one other quick tip to somebody who's just getting started, and that is in almost any policy arena, there are going to be intermediary organizations, and some of them are merely advocacy organizations that could care less about science, and some of them really do think about research and about translating that research. In homelessness, it's the National Alliance to End Homelessness. Partner with them. So, the best thing I can do for social policy around homelessness is anytime the National Alliance asks me to do something, I say yes, right? So that's often an easy way to get a start.
Fantastic.
And
Thank you. Yeah, go for it, Dr. Holt.
For the listeners along those lines, there are a number of organizations, and this has been written about in ways that can be very useful to people in the audience here. COSA, which stands for what? Coalition of Social Science Associations, whatever it is. They actually have they do good things. Go to their website. They have something called Why Science that is fun to read and I think useful in this context. The American Academy of Arts and Sciences has done reports on public science. The National Academy, a decade or more ago, under Ken Pruitt and others, came up with a report on science in public policy. And the issues on science and technology, which comes out of Dr. Cialdini's ASU and National Academy, has a whole series on science and policy the next 75 years. You know, the first 75 years was Vannevar Bush and since. Those are all things worth looking at to get a sense of the big picture.
Excellent. Thank you. We also have a toolkit that accompanies this webinar that has links to COSA and some of the other organizations that you all have shared today. I am going to need to turn this over to my colleague, Raquel Rose from New York University, to close us out as we're almost at time.
Thank you, Sarah. So I want to say a humongous thank you to Dr. BETH, SHINN, to Dr. Rush Holt, and Dr. Robert Cialdini for providing all their invaluable insights on the critical link between research and policy. And a big thank you to our team spearheaded by Dr. Stewart, to the American Psychological Association, and all the divisions that have worked really hard to make this webinar possible. We've gotten so many great questions and answers, and I can't go over all of them right now. But we do hope that you will join us all for the 4 upcoming webinars that basically work to demystify the process of conducting policy relevant research for not only researchers, but students and mentors alike throughout the remainder of 2023. Our next webinar is all about getting started. It will focus on the first steps. I know we had a couple of questions about that initial work, so please stick around for that next webinar. And the panelists will include Helen Neville, Betsy Levy, Palak, and Asia Eaton. It will be on Wednesday, April 26th at 4 p.m. Eastern. Then in the fall, we'll have more webinars on making your research matter to policymakers, managing your presence for non-academic audiences, and mentoring others in policy relevant research. And each webinar has an accompanying toolkit of resources so you can dive more deeply into each topic area. I do want to plug the toolkit again, especially for students who are asking about funding. There are interdisciplinary funding opportunities listed in that toolkit. Please remember that registration for those webinars, along with a recording of this webinar and the toolkit, will be available shortly on SPICY.org at the CODAPAR policy series link. Again, that is www.spicy.org/CODAPAR policy series. And I want to thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Any final word of wisdom you would like to share out to the audience before we close out?
Go for it.
Yeah, pleased you're talking about this.